Those flowers for somebody?
My father.
He doesn't live here.
He's buried here.
Officer, please stop. She just bought those flowers.
Back inside. This is police business.
Last chance. What were you doing behind the hardware store?
The white chrysanthemums were still in her hands when the officer knocked them to the ground. She had bought them 3 minutes earlier from a stand outside the market, a dozen of them wrapped in brown paper, and she had been standing on the sidewalk in the thin October sun, doing nothing at all, when the patrol car slid to the curb beside her and a man got out with his thumbs already hooked in his belt.
"You lost," he said. It was not a question. The woman looked at him with a calm that did not match the moment.
"No," she said. "I know exactly where I am."
That was not the answer he wanted. He circled her once, slowly, the way a man does when he has already decided something and is only looking for permission. She was in her 50s, tall, still, dressed in plain dark clothes that told him nothing, and she was a stranger in a town where he knew every face. And to Officer Roy Dalton, a stranger who would not flinch, was the most offensive thing in the world. "Those for somebody," he said, nodding at the flowers. "My father," she said. "He does not live here," Dalton said. "I would know." "He is buried here," she said. And Roy Dalton, who could not stand the way this woman looked at him, like whether she was waiting out, reached over and slapped the flowers out of her hands, and they scattered white across the gray concrete. And then he stepped on them, grinding one heel down until the paper tore and the petals bruised.
She did not move. She did not raise her voice. She looked down at the ruined flowers, and then she looked back up at him. And she said one quiet sentence that he would spend the rest of his life wishing he had listened to.
"You are going to want to remember how this started," she said. Behind the counter of the flower stand, a young vendor named Kayla had gone still, a wet cloth frozen in her hand. She had sold the woman those flowers 3 minutes ago. She had watched the whole thing, and now she did the calculation that everyone in a small town learns to do when Roy Dalton is on the sidewalk. The calculation about whether it is safer to speak or to disappear. "Officer," Kayla said carefully, "she just bought those. She did not do anything." "Get back inside," Dalton said, without turning his head. "This is police business." Kayla got back inside. She would hate herself for it later, and she would make up for it in a way none of them could yet imagine. But in that moment she stepped behind her counter and looked away, because that was what the town had been trained to do. Dalton turned back to the woman. "Last chance to explain what you were doing behind the hardware store," he said. "I have not been near the hardware store," she said.
"I have been standing on this sidewalk buying flowers, which you watched me do."
Dalton smiled, because he did not yet know that 4 separate phones on that street had just begun to record. Roy Dalton had worn the badge in Hartwell for 35 years, and in those 35 years he had come to believe the town belonged to him. It was not a large place. One long main street, a market, a diner, a church, a cemetery on the hill where the road ran out. He knew who belonged and who did not, and he policed that line with a hunger that had nothing to do with the law. People who fit got a wave. People who did not fit got stopped and questioned and made to understand, in 100 small ways, whose town this was. He had never once been made to answer for any of it. There was a reason he needed the town to be his, though he would never have said it out loud, or even to himself. Roy Dalton had grown up in Hartwell, a nobody, the kind of kid nobody picked, and he had watched the world hand out respect to people who seemed to do nothing to earn it. And he had decided that if the world would not give him a place, the badge would take one. The badge made him somebody. The badge made the diner go quiet. And every stranger who would not be afraid of him was a small reminder of the nobody he had been. So he pressed harder, and the harder he pressed, the more the town confused his cruelty for authority, and round it went for 35 years. A frightened boy in a uniform mistaking fear for love. That was the part that mattered, the part that had made him what he was. Every complaint that had ever been filed against Roy Dalton had gone somewhere quiet and never come back. He did not know exactly where, and he had never asked,
because a man who is protected learns not to look too closely at the roof over his head.
He had learned the whole trade from Warren Prentice, back when Prentice was still riding a patrol car and Dalton was a rookie who would have done anything to be noticed. Prentice had taught him the lesson that became his career in his very first month. Out on a sidewalk downtown, with a quiet man Dalton searched and shamed and never once thought about again. You show them whose town it is early, Prentice had told him that day. And you never have to say it twice. Dalton had built 35 years on that one sentence. And in all that time it had never occurred to him to wonder what happened to the quiet man. So when the stranger with the flowers refused to be afraid of him, something in him came loose. "Turn around," he said. "Hands behind your back." "For what?" she asked. Her voice had not changed. That was what enraged him most. "I picked up flowers," she said, "and I told you my father is buried on that hill. Which of those is the crime?" Dalton reached up to his shoulder, where his body camera sat blinking its small, steady light, and he pressed the button, and the light went dark. He did it in the open, in front of her, without shame, because in 35 years the little light had never once mattered. Then he keyed his radio. "Dispatch," he said, eyes locked on hers. "I have a burglary suspect resisting, requesting the report be flagged. Subject is combative." None of it was true, and both of them knew it. And she understood in that moment exactly what kind of man she was standing in front of. Because she had spent her whole life learning to read men in the seconds before they decided to do something they could not take back. She also understood something he did not. She had been recording too, in her own way, the whole time. Not with a phone, with the part of her that never stopped taking notes. Dalton grabbed her arm and slammed her forward across the hot hood of the patrol car. Across the street, a 17-year-old named Tyler Boyd stood frozen with his phone held out in front of him, filming, his hands shaking so badly the picture jumped. Beside him, two of his friends were doing the same. Further down the block, a woman filmed from a doorway. An old man filmed from the window of the diner. None of them knew each other. None of them had planned anything. They had simply seen a police officer stomp on a stranger's flowers and throw her onto a car, and some instinct older than fear had told them to hold up their phones and not look away. Dalton felt the attention the way a predator feels a change in the wind. "Cameras off," he shouted, straightening, his hand drifting toward his belt. "This is an active scene. You are interfering with a police officer." Tyler did not turn his phone off. He was terrified, and his legs were telling him to run, and he kept filming anyway. And years later, he would not be able to explain what made him hold that phone steady, except that the woman on the hood of the car was so calm. And if she could be that calm with a knee in her back, he could be brave enough to keep his hands from shaking. "Delete that," Dalton said, taking a step toward him. "Kid, I will not ask again." And the woman, folded over the hood of the car with her cheek against the hot metal and her wrists being forced together behind her, spoke without raising her voice. And somehow everyone on that street heard her. "Do not delete anything," she said. "Any of you. Keep filming. Whatever happens next, keep filming." Dalton cuffed her hard, hauled her upright, and shoved her into the back of the car. And as the door slammed, he told himself he had won. He had never been more wrong about anything in his life. She sat in the back of the patrol car and did not speak. And she did not reach for the one thing in her wallet that would have ended the entire afternoon in 90 seconds. She thought about her father. She had not been back to Hartwell in 30 years. She had left at 18 and never returned, not for holidays, not for his birthdays, not even at the end. And the flowers crushed on the sidewalk behind her were white chrysanthemums because they were the only flowers he had ever loved. And she had bought them to lay on a grave she had never once visited. Her name was Naomi Holloway. Her father's name had been Isaiah, and he had raised her alone in this town, and he had given her a single piece of advice so many times that it had become the frame her whole life hung on. "Stand tall," he used to say. "Stay calm. Let them underestimate you, and let the truth do the rest." She had built a career on those words. She had risen further than a girl from Hartwell was ever supposed to rise, into rooms where the decisions were the kind that ended or saved thousands of lives. And she had done it exactly the way her father told her. Quietly, patiently, letting men like Roy Dalton look at her and see nothing. But the advice had a shadow in it, and she had spent 30 years refusing to look at that shadow. Somewhere in her rise, she had let the discipline become a wall, and the wall had kept out everything soft, including a phone call to an old man in a small town who had wanted, more than anything, just to hear his daughter's voice before he died. He had died without it. She could still hear the last voicemail he had left her, 8 months before the end. She had listened to it once, standing in an airport in another country, and she had told herself she would call him back when the operation closed out, when the schedule cleared, when there was a quiet hour. There is always supposed to be a quiet hour later. His voice had been thin on the recording, thinner than she remembered it, and he had not asked her for anything. He had only said that he had seen her name in an article, and that he was proud, and that he hoped she was eating enough, and that he loved her, and that there was no need to call back if she was busy. He just wanted her to hear it. She had saved the message and not called back. And 8 months later, a stranger from the county called instead. That was the thing she carried into Hartwell, heavier than any rank. Not anger, grief, and a guilt she could not put down. She had come to lay flowers and to say the words she had never said, and instead she was sitting handcuffed in the back of a patrol car, and the only thing keeping her calm was the voice of a dead man, telling her to let the truth do the rest. She just did not know yet how much truth this town had buried. At the station, Roy Dalton sat down at a keyboard and began to write a story. It was a good story, by his standards. In it, a suspicious woman had been seen near the rear of the closed hardware store. In it, she had become aggressive when questioned, had refused lawful commands, had physically resisted arrest. In it, Officer Roy Dalton had acted with restraint and professionalism, and his body camera had unfortunately malfunctioned, as these devices sometimes do. He typed it with the easy confidence of a man who had typed this kind of story many times before, and he expected the woman in the holding cell to do what they all eventually did: break, cry, sign whatever he put in front of her just to make it stop. While he wrote, a younger officer named Katie Brennan stood at the intake counter, processing the arrested woman's belongings into a plastic tray. Katie had been on the force for 2 years. She had joined because she believed the badge could be a good thing, and she had spent most of those 2 years quietly learning that in Hartwell it often was not. And she had not yet decided what to do about that. She was afraid of Dalton. She was more afraid of Prentice, the chief, who had a way of looking at you that made you feel your whole future was a thing he was holding in one hand. She logged the woman's watch, her keys, a worn photograph of an older man she did not recognize. Then she opened the wallet. She saw the ordinary things first: a little cash, a bank card, a folded receipt. Then behind them she found another card, and she went still. It was official, embossed, federal, the kind of identification that does not belong in a plastic tray in a small-town police station, and the seal on it and the line of rank printed beneath the name made her read it 3 times to be sure her eyes were not inventing something. They were not. She did not know the full weight of what she was holding. She knew enough. She knew this woman was not a drifter or a burglar, or anything Roy Dalton had put in his report. She knew this was the kind of person who had a direct line to rooms where the decisions were the kind that ended careers. And she knew that the plain, quiet woman in the holding cell had let herself be searched, cuffed, and slandered without once reaching for the one card that would have stopped all of it in a single sentence. And that frightened Katie more than anything else, because it meant the woman was not afraid, and people who are not afraid usually know something you do not. She looked over her shoulder. Dalton was 2 desks away, humming to himself, typing. Down the hall, the chief's door was open a crack. Katie Brennan stood very still, holding the wallet of a woman whose rank she had read 3 times and still could not quite make herself believe. Listening to Roy Dalton cheerfully typing up a fabricated report about a resisting burglary suspect. And she understood, with a cold clarity, that she was now standing inside the worst mistake this department had ever made. Everything in her wanted to walk to Dalton's desk and drop the wallet in front of him and watch his face. Everything else in her, the part that had survived 2 years in this building, told her to keep her mouth shut and her eyes down. She had about 10 seconds to decide which side of it she was going to be on. She did not say anything. That was the shameful truth of the next few minutes, and Katie would carry it. She closed the wallet. She set it in the tray. She told herself she needed to think,
that she needed to be sure, that a card could be many things, and each of those thoughts was a small door she was quietly closing on the thing she already knew. Because she was afraid. Because Dalton was 2 desks away, and Prentice was down the hall, and because 2 years in Hartwell had taught her exactly what happened to officers who broke ranks. They did not last. Their complaints vanished. Their careers developed strange, quiet problems. She had watched it happen to better cops than her. So she carried the tray to the property room, and she said nothing. And she hated herself a little with every step. In the holding cell, Naomi sat with her back straight and her hands folded and waited. And when Dalton finally came in with his printed report and a pen, she looked at the pen and then at him and did not reach for it. "Read it and sign at the bottom," he said. "Saves us both a long night." "I am not going to sign that," she said. He set the pen down on the metal table with exaggerated patience. "You think this is the first time somebody sat where you are sitting and told me no?" He said. "It is not. They all say no at first, and then they think about their job and their family and how long the night is and how it is going to be their word against a decorated officer, and they sign. Everybody signs, eventually." "I am not everybody," she said. It was not a boast. She said it the way a person states the weather. He leaned against the doorframe, unhurried, certain. "You do not seem to understand your situation," he said. "In this town, my report is the truth. There is no video. There is no witness who matters. There is what I wrote and your word. And out here, lady, your word is worth exactly nothing." Naomi looked at him for a long moment. "You keep saying there is no video," she said quietly. Dalton smiled. "There is not." She did not smile back. "There were 4 phones on that street," she said. "And by now I would guess there are a great many more than 4 people watching them." Something in his certainty flickered, just for a second, and then he pushed it down. Because Roy Dalton had been protected for 35 years, and a protected man does not know how to be afraid till the roof is already gone. "Sign it or do not," he said, gathering the report. "It changes nothing. Outside the walls of that station, she was right. And it was already far too late to stop." Tyler Boyd had posted his video at 4:11 in the afternoon, with shaking hands and a caption that was only 3 words long. "This is Hartwell." He had not expected anyone to see it. He had posted it the way you post a thing you are afraid to keep to yourself, hoping someone older and braver would know what to do. By morning, millions of strangers did. By 6 o'clock, it had 200,000 views. By 9, it had 1 million. The other phones found their way online too. 4 angles, then 5, then a dozen, all of the same 45 seconds. A police officer knocking flowers from a woman's hands, stomping them, slamming her across a car while she never once raised her hands or her voice, shouting at teenagers to stop filming. And through all of it, the woman, calm, upright, saying the same thing over and over. Keep filming. The internet did what the internet does. It could not look away, and it did not want to. By morning, the videos had national news attached to them, and by afternoon, they had something far more dangerous to Roy Dalton than news. They had the attention of federal civil rights investigators. Somewhere in a city 300 miles away, a woman named Agent Angela Reyes watched the footage on a laptop in a quiet office. And she watched the officer reach up and press the button on his own body camera before he keyed his radio. And she leaned back in her chair and said, to no one in particular, "There it is." She had spent her career on cases exactly like this one, and most of them died in the dark. One person's word against a department that closed ranks. But this one had 4 angles, and a timestamp, and a small blinking light going out on camera. And this one had a stranger who had done nothing but stand still. And Agent Reyes knew a rare thing when she saw it. She knew she was looking at a case that could finally open a door someone had been holding shut for a very long time. She reached for her phone and booked a flight to a town she had never heard of. And as she did, in that same town, a phone was ringing on the desk of a man who had spent 15 years making sure phones like this one never rang. Chief Warren Prentice had run the Hartwell Police Department for 15 years,
And in all that time, he had understood his real job with perfect clarity. His real job was not the law. His real job was to keep the town's picture of itself intact. Hartwell was a good place, decent people, quiet streets, and every complaint that threatened that picture was, to Prentice, a kind of vandalism, a thing to be cleaned up before the neighbors saw. He did not think of himself as corrupt. When a young officer had once asked him, years ago, how he could stand to bury an honest man's complaint, Prentice had put a hand on the boy's shoulder and said, "We are not burying anything, son. We are protecting people from a story they cannot unhear." He had said it so many times, to himself most of all, that he had come to believe it. And belief was the thing that let him sleep. Down in the basement of the station, in a locked room behind the boiler, there were boxes. In those boxes were complaints. Roy Dalton's name was on many of them, and other names too, going back further than Prentice's own tenure. Decades of ordinary people who had walked into that station bleeding or shaking or furious and filed a piece of paper, believing it would matter. None of it had ever mattered. Prentice had made sure of that, box by box, year by year, telling himself each time that he was protecting something worth protecting. He watched the videos in his office with the door closed, and he felt the old machinery start up inside him. The same machinery that had buried 40 complaints. Contain it. Control the story. Make it small. He had done it 100 times. He was very good at it. He called Dalton in. "Tell me she signed something," Prentice said. "She would not sign," Dalton said. "But it does not matter. There is no proof of anything. My camera was off." Prentice closed his eyes. "Your camera was off," he repeated slowly. "Roy, there are 4 cameras that were not off." For the first time, something crossed Dalton's face that had not been there all day. The beginning of fear. "We handle it the way we always handle it," Prentice said, and his voice was calm. And that calm had smothered 15 years of the truth. "The video is edited. The woman is unstable. The department stands behind its officer while we conduct a thorough internal review. And that review takes as long as it needs to take." He looked at Dalton. "And you get Brennan to make the body camera data disappear," he said. "Tonight, before anyone official comes asking for it." Neither of them knew that Katie Brennan was standing just outside the door. It looked, for about a day, like Hartwell was going to bury this the way it had buried everything else. The department put out a statement full of careful words. The officer had followed protocol. The footage was misleading and taken out of context. An internal review was underway. The union sent a lawyer. A local official who owed Prentice a favor went on the radio and talked about how hard these officers worked and how quick people were to judge. Somewhere in a comment section, the phrase, "she probably did something," started to appear. Dalton felt the ground steady under his feet again. This was familiar. This was how it always went. The noise would peak, and then it would fade, and in a month no one would remember, and he would still be wearing the badge, and the town would still be his. He even grew bold enough to talk. He stood in the diner with a coffee and told anyone who would listen that the woman had been aggressive, that the videos did not show the 10 minutes before, that people had no idea how dangerous his job was. A few older men nodded along because they had known Roy Dalton since he was a boy, and it was easier to nod than to look at the thing squarely. He mistook their nodding for the whole town. He always had. What he did not see was the rest of the diner going quiet. He did not see the waitress stop refilling his cup. He did not see the young family in the corner booth pay early and leave. The town was not agreeing with him. The town was watching him, the way you watch a man who does not yet know he is standing in a house that has already caught fire. And Katie Brennan was called into a back room and handed the body camera docking log and told, quietly, by the chief himself, that the file from Dalton's camera had corrupted during upload and that she should confirm that in the system, and that if she did, her future in this department was very bright. She stood there with the log in her hands and understood exactly what she was being asked to do. She had not known until she was holding that log that 2 quiet years of watching and swallowing and looking away had all been leading her to a single line of data. The camera had not corrupted. The file was intact. She had already seen the metadata, and the metadata did not show a malfunction.
It showed a clean, deliberate manual shutoff at 3:52 in the afternoon, 11 seconds before Dalton keyed his radio to call in a lie. The truth was sitting right there in a line of data, and all she had to do to make it vanish was type 3 words: file corrupted, unrecoverable.
She thought about the woman in the holding cell who had told a street full of strangers to keep filming. She thought about the card she had found in that wallet, the one she had told no one about. And Katie Brennan did the bravest thing she would ever do. She said, "I need to make a copy first, for the review file." And Prentice nodded, because Prentice had never once imagined that the copy would not be the thing that disappeared. That night, Katie Brennan copied the intact body camera data onto a drive, drove it to her sister's house 2 towns over, and did not sleep at all. Agent Angela Reyes arrived in Hartwell on the 3rd day, and she did not come alone. She came with a team and a warrant, and the flat, unhurried manner of a person who has watched a great many powerful men assume they were untouchable, and has watched most of them be wrong. She sat across from Chief Prentice in his own office and let him give her the careful words, the misleading footage, the ongoing review. And she wrote none of it down, because she was not there for his story. She was there for his data. "I'm going to need every body camera file from that afternoon," she said. "Original, unaltered, with full metadata. And I'm going to need it in the next hour." "There was a malfunction," Prentice began. "The file corrupted during upload," our officer confirmed. "Which officer?" Reyes said. And behind Prentice in the doorway, a young voice said, "That would be me, sir." Katie Brennan stepped into the room, and she was pale, and her hands were not entirely steady. But she looked at Agent Reyes, and not at her chief, and she said, "The file did not corrupt. I have the original. I copied it before anyone asked me to lose it. And I can tell you the exact second Officer Dalton turned his camera off, because it is right there in the data, and it does not match anything in his report." The room went very still. Reyes's team synced the intact body camera metadata against the 4 bystander videos, against timestamp, and the picture that emerged was airtight. At 3:52 and 11 seconds, the camera was manually deactivated. At 3:52 and 22 seconds, the radio call reporting a resisting burglary suspect went out. The bystander footage covered every one of those seconds, and in none of them was Naomi anything but still. "Walk me through it one more time," Reyes said to Katie, "so I am certain." Katie pointed at the screen. "This entry here is the shutoff," she said. "It logs as a manual power event, not a fault. A malfunction leaves a different signature, a broken write, a corruption flag. This is clean. Somebody reached up and turned it off on purpose." 11 seconds later, he is on the radio saying she is resisting. "She never moved. It is all right there." "And you were ordered to erase this," Reyes said. "I was told the file corrupted," Katie said, "by the chief, and told my future was bright if I confirmed it in the system." Reyes looked at her for a moment. "You know what you just did," she said, "to your own career in this town." "Yes," Katie said. "I've been afraid of this building for 2 years. I'm done being afraid of it." It was no longer one person's word against the department. It was a machine of lies with its own timestamps printed on the side. And then Agent Reyes did the thing Prentice had been dreading for 15 years. She stood up, and she asked to see the basement. The story that had started with a woman and some flowers now became something much larger. And it happened in the space of a single afternoon. The reporters who had come for the video of the arrest learned, from a source no one ever named, exactly who the calm woman in the footage had been. Not a drifter, not a suspect, a 4-star general of the United States Army, one of the highest-ranking officers alive, a woman who had commanded more people than lived in the entire county, standing on a sidewalk in her hometown, holding flowers for her dead father, arrested and slammed across a car by a man who decided she did not belong. The town of Hartwell broke open like a struck bell. Roy Dalton learned who she was from a television in the break room, and he had to sit down because the floor had gone soft beneath him. Every certainty he had built his 35 years on, every idea about who mattered and who did not, every assumption that had let him press that button and key that radio, collapsed at once into a single unbearable fact. He had not caught an outsider who did not fit. He had assaulted a general on camera, in the open, and lied about it in writing. And there were 4 videos and a metadata trail and a young officer who had already told the truth. He kept replaying the sidewalk in his mind, looking for the moment he could have stopped. And there were so many of them. He could have walked past her. He could have let her buy her flowers. He could have believed her when she said her father was on the hill. At any second in that encounter, he could have simply chosen not to be the smallest version of himself. And he had chosen it every single time. And now the whole country had watched him do it.
Roy Dalton did not fall quietly, because a man who has never once been made to answer does not know how to. He hired a lawyer, a sharp one from the city, the kind who has kept worse men than Dalton out of trouble. And the lawyer did what those lawyers do. He went to the cameras and called the videos edited and misleading. He said his client had followed protocol in a dangerous situation. He suggested, without quite saying it, that a woman with the connections this one obviously had could turn a small-town officer into anything she wanted, and the people ought to ask themselves who really held the power here.
It was a lie so upside down it should not have worked, and in some corners it worked anyway, because there is always a corner where people would rather believe a familiar man than an inconvenient truth. Then Dalton did the uglier thing. He turned on Katie Brennan. He could not reach the general, so he reached for the rookie. He told anyone who would listen that Brennan was a bitter young officer with a grudge, that she had invented the metadata story to save a failing career, that nothing she said could be trusted. He had the union file a complaint against her. He got Prentice to quietly start the paperwork that would put her on leave. For 3 days, the one person who had risked everything to tell the truth watched her own name dragged through the mud by the man she had exposed. And there were nights she sat in her sister's kitchen, certain she had ruined herself for nothing.
"Hold on," Naomi told her, when Katie came to her nearly in tears. "Whatever they say about you now, the record does not change. You made a copy. That is the only fact that will still be standing when the noise is gone." And then Dalton tried the last, worst thing. He knew, the way guilty men know, that the real danger was not the video. It was the basement. It was the boxes behind the boiler. The 15 years and more of buried paper that would turn one bad arrest into a pattern, a career, a crime. So he went to Prentice in the dark, and the two of them agreed that the boxes had to be gone before any warrant reached them. A burst pipe, a small fire, an accident, the way accidents had always been arranged in this town.
They were hours too late. Katie Brennan, who knew both men better than they knew themselves, had already told Agent Reyes exactly where to look. And Reyes had sealed the basement the night before with a federal lock on the door. When Dalton came down the stairs with the story about checking the pipes, there was a young federal agent sitting on a folding chair in front of the boiler, and she looked up at him and said, "Can I help you find something, officer?" He turned around and climbed back up the stairs, and somewhere on those steps he finally understood, in his gut, that 35 years of protection had run out. None of it saved him. Not the lawyer, not the smear, not the fire he never got to set. And none of it was even the thing that finished him. Because Agent Reyes was in the basement now, behind the boiler, in the locked room, and her team was carrying up boxes, 40 of them, more. 15 years, and further back, complaint. Ordinary people who had walked into that station believing a piece of paper would matter and had been proven wrong by a man who called himself a caretaker. Reyes read through them one at a time, her jaw tightening. And near the bottom of the oldest box, in a file softened by 30 years of dust, she found a name that made her stop. She read it twice. Then she picked up her phone and called the one person she thought should hear it before anyone else did. She called Naomi. "There is something down here," Reyes said, "that you need to see. It has your father's name on it." Naomi stood in the basement of the Hartwell police station and held a piece of paper her father had signed 35 years before. It was a complaint. Isaiah Holloway, in careful handwriting she would have known anywhere, had walked into this station when she was a teenager and reported that officers had stopped him without cause, searched him on the street in front of his neighbors, damaged his small repair shop looking for something that was never there, and called him a name she could not read now without her vision blurring. He had asked in the last line for nothing more than an acknowledgement that it had happened. There was no acknowledgement. There was only the box and the boiler, and 35 years of dust. Agent Reyes stood a few feet away and said nothing, because there are moments a person has to be allowed to have alone, even in a crowded room. Naomi read it twice. Then she read the last line a third time, the line where her father asked for nothing but to be told it had happened. And her hands, which had not shaken when a man forced them behind her back, began to shake now. "I did not know he did this," she said, mostly to herself. "He never said a word." She remembered that year. She remembered her father coming home smaller than he had left. She remembered the shop closing, and the way he stopped waving to people on the street, and the way something in him had gone quiet and stayed quiet. She had been 17 and angry, and certain that if her father had only fought harder, stood taller, the town would have had to listen. She had left for the army the next year, swearing she would become someone no one could do this to. She had never known he filed anything. He had never told her. He had taken his advice to her: stand tall, stay calm, let the truth do the rest. And he had tried to live it himself, and the truth had been carried down a set of stairs and locked behind a boiler and left to rot. He had died believing it would never come out. That was the weight that finally landed on Naomi, standing in that basement, and it was heavier than the badge that had been pressed into her back, and heavier than 30 years of grief. Her father had told her to trust the truth, and the truth had failed him, and he had never once let her see that it had, because he had wanted his daughter to believe in something even after it had broken him. And she had repaid that by staying away, by letting her own calm become a wall, by burying herself in duty in the exact way he had buried his complaint, quietly, without complaint, until it was too late. She had told herself for 30 years that she stayed away because she was needed elsewhere, because the work mattered, because there would be time. There had not been time. He had gone into the ground in this town with the truth still locked beneath the station, and his daughter, who could have called any day of any of those years, had let the phone sit silent. And then Reyes, who had stepped closer to read over her shoulder, said one more thing, quietly. The way you say a thing you wish you did not have to. "There are 2 officers named on the original report," she said, "the ones who stopped him." She turned the page so Naomi could see. The senior officer, the one who had directed the stop, the one whose signature had buried the whole thing, was listed as W. Prentice. And below him, the junior officer, the rookie, the one who had done the searching, who had put his hands on Isaiah Holloway and torn apart his shop, while an older man stood back and taught him how it was done, was listed as Dalton. Naomi read the 2 names, and the whole afternoon rearranged itself behind her eyes. The man who had knocked the flowers from her hands. The man who had buried her complaint in a boiler room. They were not 2 strangers she had the misfortune to meet in one bad week. They were the same 2 men who had broken her father 35 years ago, on a sidewalk in this same town. And they had done it so casually, so routinely, that neither of them had recognized his daughter when she came home. Roy Dalton did not remember Isaiah. That was the part that would stay with her longest. To her father, that day had been the end of something, the quiet beginning of the smaller man he became. To Dalton, it had been nothing. One stop among thousands, a lesson he learned so well that he spent 35 years repeating it, all the way down to the daughter of the first man he ever practiced it on. "You show them whose town it is early," Prentice had told a rookie once. "And you never have to say it twice." They had said it to her father. They had said it to her. And they had no idea, either of them, that they had just done it to the one person in the world who finally had the standing and the reason and the patience to make them answer. Tucked behind the last page of the complaint, in her father's own careful hand, was a single line he had written to no one but himself. "Stand tall, stay calm, let the truth do the rest." He had written down his own advice on the day the truth failed him and folded it into the file and left it there and gone home and never spoken of it again. She stood there for a long time. Then she wiped her face with the back of her hand and did the only thing left to do. She decided how this was going to end. She could have ended it in an hour. That was the thing everyone around her assumed she would do, and it was the thing Roy Dalton was privately praying she would not. A 4-star general has friends, She could have made a single phone call and turned the full weight of official Washington onto a small corrupt department, and no one would have blamed her. And it would have been over by dinner, clean and total and personal.
Agent Reyes half expected it. "Say the word," Reyes told her quietly, "and this becomes a very different kind of case very fast. One phone call, you know that. I have seen people with a tenth of your standing burn a department to the ground for far less than what this man did to you."
Naomi shook her head. "No," she said. "If this ends because of who I am, then the town learns exactly the wrong lesson. It learns that justice is a thing you get if you happen to have 4 stars in your wallet, and the next person Roy Dalton stops will not have 4 stars. The next person will be a teenager or a grandmother or a man with a small repair shop who just wants to be left alone. They will have a piece of paper and their own 2 hands and nothing else." She looked at the boxes. "My father had nothing else," she said. "So we do this by the book, every step. The same book that is supposed to protect the person with nothing. If it does not work for them, it does not work, and I want the whole country to watch whether it works." "But you make yourself a witness that way," Reyes said. "Not a general. Just a woman who has to sit and be questioned and wait like everyone else. That is slower and it is harder, and it means you cannot control it." "I know," Naomi said. "That is the point. My father waited. He waited his whole life and died still waiting. The least I can do is wait the honest way, out in the open, where everyone can see whether the system finally keeps its promise." Reyes looked at her for a long moment, and then she nodded. Because in 30 years of this work, she had rarely met someone who understood so clearly the difference between winning and being right. It was not the easy choice. It was slower and harder, and it meant she had to stand in the open as a witness and answer questions and let the process crawl through every stage it was designed to crawl through. It meant she could not simply make the pain of the man who had hurt her disappear. She had to let a system that had failed her father prove, on camera, in public, that it could finally do the thing it was built to do. And by choosing that, without meaning to, she gave the town something it had not had in 15 years. She gave the other victims permission to stop being afraid. The first to come forward was an old woman named Mabel Turner, and she came to Naomi directly, at the small house Naomi had rented near the cemetery. "I knew your father," Mabel said, standing on the porch with her hands folded. "Isaiah fixed my radio more times than I can count and never charged me right. He was a good man, and this town took something from him. And I have been carrying my own piece of that for a long time, and I am too old now to keep carrying it quiet." Mabel Turner had filed a complaint of her own, 11 years earlier, after Roy Dalton had searched her home without cause and left it torn apart, and told her that if she said a word about it, she would regret it. She had said nothing. For 11 years, she had told herself that no one would believe an old woman over an officer, and she had watched him keep his badge, and she had felt the shame of her own silence every single day. "I am not afraid of him anymore," Mabel said. "I do not have the years left to be afraid." She was the first. She was not the last. Kayla, the flower vendor who had looked away on the sidewalk, came forward 2 days later, and she did not come with a complaint of her own. She came with something better. "I have a security camera on my stand," she told Agent Reyes, "for people who steal buckets. It points at the street." It was running the whole time. She had said nothing for 3 days out of the old reflex of fear, and then she had watched a teenager and an old woman stand up in front of the whole country, and she had gone home and pulled the footage, and could not look at herself until she brought it in. It gave Reyes a 5th angle, cleaner than the rest, and it caught the exact moment Dalton pressed the button on his camera. One by one, the people whose complaints had been carried down those basement stairs began to come out of their houses. A man named Andre, who had been beaten in a parking lot and told to say he fell. A mother whose son had been arrested for a burglary that happened while the boy was 3 counties away at a track meet, with 50 witnesses and a ribbon to prove it. The teenagers, led by Tyler Boyd, who stood in front of the cameras and said, on the record, that Officer Dalton had ordered them to delete their videos and threatened them when they refused. "They asked me why I did not just delete it," Tyler said, when a reporter pushed a microphone at him. "Everybody keeps asking that. He looked into the lens, this 17-year-old with a shaking voice and a spine of iron. "Because she told me not to," he said. "She was the one in handcuffs, and she told me to keep filming, so I kept filming." Each of them had believed for years that they were alone. Each of them learned in the space of a single week that they had never been alone at all. There had been 40 of them in a locked room, and now there were 40 of them standing in the light. Agent Reyes took every statement, cross-referenced every date, and built something that no edited statement and no union lawyer could take apart. Not a story, a record. The thing Hartwell had spent 15 years refusing to keep. And at the center of it, calm, patient, refusing every shortcut, stood a woman who had learned from her father how to let the truth do the rest, and who was finally, 35 years too late, giving him the one thing he had asked for, an acknowledgement that it had happened. Roy Dalton's fall, when it finally came, was not loud. That was the strange mercy and the strange cruelty of doing things by the book. There was no dramatic scene, no single moment of collapse for the cameras. There was only the slow, total, documented dismantling of a man, one signature at a time. His badge was taken. His gun was taken. He was charged with assault, with filing a false report, and with tampering with evidence. And the tampering charge was the one that could not be argued away, because a young officer had preserved the very data he had tried to erase, and the timestamps did the rest. He sat in a courtroom months later and listened to a prosecutor lay it all out. The button pressed on camera, the radio call 11 seconds later, the 4 videos, the 5th from the flower stand, the 40 complaints, the basement, the boiler. He listened to Mabel Turner describe her torn-apart home in a voice that did not shake. "He told me if I said a word I would regret it," Mabel told the court, her hands folded on the rail in front of her. "And I believed him, because in this town he was right. For a long time he was right. So I said nothing for 11 years. She turned her head and looked at Dalton directly, an old woman looking at the man who had frightened her into a decade of silence. "I am 91 years old," she said. "I have buried a husband and 2 of my children. And I want you to know that the thing I was most ashamed of at the end of my life was being afraid of a small man like you. I am not ashamed anymore." He listened to a teenager describe being threatened for holding up a phone. And he could not do the thing he had done his entire career, which was to make his version the only version. Because for the first time in 35 years, there was a record, and the record did not care what Roy Dalton said. There was one more thing he had to sit and hear, and it was the one that finally broke something in him. The prosecutor read into the record the oldest complaint from the basement, the one 35 years old, and read the names of the 2 officers on it, and asked Roy Dalton for the record whether he remembered a man named Isaiah Holloway. He did not. He searched his memory in front of the whole courtroom, and there was nothing there, no face, no day, nothing. And that emptiness was its own verdict. He had ended a man so completely and so carelessly that the ending had not even left a mark on him. And 35 years later, he had walked up to that man's daughter on a sidewalk and done it again. And he had not known. Because to Roy Dalton, the people he stepped on had never been real enough to remember. The daughter had remembered. The daughter had come home. And the daughter had made very sure that this time there would be a record he could never make disappear. He was sentenced to real prison time, not a slap, not a suspension, not a quiet retirement in another county. Prison. As they lit him out, he looked, the way men like him always look at the end, for the face of the person he blamed. He found Naomi in the gallery, sitting straight, calm, exactly as she had been on the hood of his car, and he waited for something, a smile, a flicker of triumph, anything he could take with him and turn into a grievance. She gave him nothing. She only looked at him the way you look at weather that has finally passed. And that, more than the handcuffs, was the thing he could not bear, because it told him the truth he had spent his whole life running from. He had never mattered to her at all. He had only ever been a small man who mistook a badge for a soul. The door closed behind him. It did not reopen. Warren Prentice did not go to prison. And in some ways, what happened to him was worse. He was forced to resign, publicly, in disgrace. The caretaker exposed as the thing he had spent 15 years pretending he was not. The story of the boiler room and the 40 buried complaints ran everywhere, and there was no careful statement that could soften it, because you cannot spin a locked room full of other people's pain. His name became, in that town and beyond it, a shorthand for the quiet cowardice that lets abuse survive. The official who looks the other way and calls it protecting the community.
On his last day, he tried, once, to explain himself. A reporter caught him on the steps and asked him why. Prentice stopped, and for a moment the mask slipped, and what was underneath was not a villain but something smaller and sadder. "I thought I was holding the town together," he said. "Every one of those complaints was a crack, and I thought if I just kept them out of the light, the whole thing would not come apart." He seemed almost to believe it. That was the horror of Warren Prentice. He had done 15 years of damage, and he had done it while feeling like a good man carrying a heavy load. And he had never once let himself understand that the thing he was protecting the town from was the truth about itself.
And the town he had spent his career protecting from the truth got the truth anyway. All of it, at once, and had to look at it. But the true consequence, the one that would outlast every headline, was structural. The Hartwell Police Department was placed under federal oversight. New body cameras were installed, the kind that cannot be switched off by the officer wearing them, the kind that would have made Roy Dalton's lie impossible before it started. An independent complaint board was created, made up of citizens, with no boiler room and no locked door, where a piece of paper filed by an ordinary person would go into the light instead of into a box. They hung the board's first meeting notice on the same wall where, for years, only the department's own awards had hung. The next person Roy Dalton would have stopped, the teenager, the grandmother, the man with the small shop, was now protected by a system that finally had to answer for itself. Not because that person had 4 stars, because a woman who did had refused to use them as a shortcut, and had insisted instead that the door be fixed for everyone who came after. Katie Brennan kept her badge. She had earned it, at last, in the only way that counted, by risking it. She would spend the rest of her career as the officer who had made a copy when she was told to make a file disappear, and she would never again wonder whether the badge could be a good thing, because she had held it in her own 2 shaking hands and made it one. Before Naomi left town, Katie came to see her, and she did not really know what she had come to say. "I almost did not," she admitted, standing in the doorway. "When I saw the stars in your wallet, I put it back in the tray and I walked away and I said nothing, because I was scared. For a whole day I said nothing. I am not proud of that." Naomi considered her. "You made a copy when it counted," she said. "That is the only part the record will remember, and it is the only part that mattered. Most people do not get the day back where they were afraid. You did. You used it." She paused. "My father did not have a Katie Brennan in that station," she said. "If he had, I would have grown up in a different town. Do not ever let anyone tell you what you did was small." Katie Brennan did not cry until she got to her car, and on a clear morning, when the reporters had finally gone and the cameras were finally off, Naomi drove up the road to the place where the road ran out. The cemetery on the hill was quiet, the way she remembered it. The grass gone gold with the season, the stones patient in the sun. She had bought new flowers, white chrysanthemums, a dozen of them, wrapped in brown paper, because they were the only flowers her father had ever loved, and because the first ones were still ground into a sidewalk downtown as evidence in a file that would outlive them both. She found his stone. Isaiah Holloway. The dates. Nothing else, because he had been a man who never asked for anything else. She knelt, and she laid the flowers down, and for a while she did not say anything at all. Because 30 years of things unsaid do not come easily, and she had never been a woman who found words the way she found her calm. "I read it," she finally said. "Your complaint. I know what they did to you, and I know you never told me, and I think I know why. You did not want me to stop believing." "I found the other thing too," she said. "The line you wrote to yourself and hid in the file. The same words you gave me. Stand tall, stay calm, let the truth do the rest. You wrote that down on the worst day of your life, The day it failed you, and you kept it, and you still handed it to me like it had never let you down. I used to think that made you naive. I understand now it made you the bravest man I ever knew." She touched the top of the stone. "You told me to stay calm and let the truth do the rest," she said. "And the truth failed you. It failed you, and you never let me see it, and you kept telling me to trust it anyway. I do not know how you did that. I have spent my whole life trying to be as strong as you were in the one thing you never got to win."
"I am sorry I did not call," she said, and her voice finally broke on it. The thing she had carried further than any rank. "I got your message. I got all of them. I kept telling myself there would be time. I am sorry, Daddy. I would give back every star for one of those hours I thought I was too busy to spend." The wind moved through the gold grass, and she let it. And for once, she did not fold the grief up small and put it away. She let it sit in the open, the way she had made the town let everything sit in the open, because she understood now that this was the whole of what he had been trying to teach her. Not how to be untouchable, how to stay soft enough to still be broken by the right things.
It came out, she told him. All of it. Every name in that room. It took 35 years, and it should not have taken any at all, but it came out, and the door is open now, and it is going to stay open. You were right. You were just early. She stayed there a long time. A woman who had commanded armies, kneeling in the grass beside her father. Finally, home.
He had told her, when she was a girl, that the loudest man in the room is almost never the strongest. That real strength does not need to shout. That you can stand tall and stay calm and let the world underestimate you. And that if you are patient, and if you do not become the thing that hurt you, the truth will do the rest. He had believed it even when it was taken from him. He had handed it to her like the only inheritance he had.
She had spent 30 years thinking the lesson was about how to win. Kneeling in the gold grass with the white flowers between her hands, she finally understood that it had always been about who you refuse to become on the way there.